have an evidential faith. They need to know intellectually why Christianity is true. All right, so make sure that for the rest of tonight's session, you're starting on page 7 of your curriculum packet. And forgive me for not letting you know that first. Take a moment to look that over so you can fill in the blanks for the introduction in each session as we go along. I'm giving you a second to look settled. I was supposed to do that first. All right, when I can see everybody's got their place in the right page in the right place. All right. All right, so the best way to stop this really is to start here. Thinking apologetically should not be foreign to our teenagers and young adults, and it won't be if we introduce these concepts to them when they're little. Learning letters and numbers are the necessary building blocks for children to learn language and math skills, and in the same way, we need to be teaching apologetic building blocks. We need to teach them that just because the majority believes something doesn't mean it's true. And they need to know that science and the Christian worldview are compatible. We need to actively teach them from their earliest youth that God is real, the Bible is true, and that Scripture is our starting point for learning about ourselves, life, and the world around us. And what about the older people in our lives that we love? They represent another great reason to have a foundational understanding about Christian apologetics. Sadly, there are many people who have always been busy with religious activities, but have never developed a relationship with Jesus. Do not ever take it for granted that our older friends and relatives are saved. Here's an example of why that's a dangerous assumption to make. Over a number of years, I personally developed a very close friendship with a gentleman I worked for in his 90s. He was a pillar of the community, given to generosity and good works, and was an elder of a local congregation where he had been a member for many, many years. He was preparing to move quite a distance away to an assisted living environment, and I knew I was probably speaking to him in person for the very last time. In spite of his position and his community in the community and in the church, I felt compelled to ask him where he was at in his relationship with Jesus. So I asked him, and I'll never forget the shock I felt or the way my heart dropped when he answered. He said, "I don't know. Church has always been a social activity for me. It's just something I'm supposed to do." He had learned the bare bones of the gospel message. He knew what he was supposed to believe, but he was never taught about the reasoning or the evidence to support those beliefs. Additionally, everything he heard and experienced outside of the church taught him why he shouldn't believe it. And yet, the Christian worldview is logical and reasonable. It's not based on a blind faith, but on robust evidentiary premises. Now, regardless of a person's age, what they believe won't remain relevant to them unless they have good reasons to believe it. That's why it's important to teach apologetics. So here's the 4 questions that we've been going through. Does truth exist? Does God exist? Are miracles possible? And is the New Testament true? If we can answer yes to these 4 questions, we can reasonably conclude that the Bible is true. We can show that the Christian worldview is an accurate match for the reality in which we live, the reality we all experience. In our first session last week, we found out that the answer to question number 1 is yes, truth does exist and relativism is false. We began to look at evidence to help us answer question number 2, does God exist? To do that, we are looking at these 3 great arguments for the existence of a theistic God. A theistic God means a God that created and sustains the universe, but that is separate and distinct from the universe. We already looked at evidence for the cosmological argument, evidence that shows the universe had a beginning. The cosmological argument dictates that since the universe had a beginning, it must have a beginner, something that created it. We also looked at the teleological argument, which provides evidence that there is design in both the universe and in living systems. The teleological argument concludes that where there is design, there must be a designer. Now, we need to take a quick detour before we look at our 3rd argument for a theistic God. Why? Because when you try to share what you know of the universe or the intelligent design we see in the universe and life itself, it won't be long before you hear, dun, 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 the evolution objection. Evolution explains life in the universe. Evolution proves there is no God. We'll see that even if the Darwinian concept of evolution is true, it doesn't disprove God or eliminate the need for the universe to have a creator and a designer. So now we start lesson 5. Make sure you're on page 8 of your curriculum. Take just a moment to look that over. This lesson has more questions than any of the other lessons we'll cover today, but don't worry if you can't get to every answer during the presentation. You'll be able to find the answer key on our website, and the address is in your curriculum packet at the end of the material for this session. The title to lesson 5 asks the question, what about evolution? Well, yeah, what about evolution? What does science say about evolution? Science doesn't say anything. Scientists do. All data needs to be interpreted. This is a very important lesson for all of us to remember. All too often, we hear so-called facts presented with the preface, science says. We'll use the Grand Canyon to explain why this is a problem. Regardless of their worldview, scientists all have access to the same data. Because of their worldview, they may then interpret that data very differently. A scientist with an evolutionary worldview will interpret the data offered by the Grand Canyon and conclude that it was created by a little bit of water over a long period of time. A creation scientist will consider the same data and conclude that the canyon was created by a lot of water in a very short amount of time. Specifically, the time reference biblical account of the flood. So don't be duped by anyone telling you what science says. Science doesn't say anything. Scientists do. All data needs to be interpreted. Now, with that lesson firmly in place, we'll continue exploring the evolution objection. When somebody poses the evolution objection, the first thing you need to do is ask the person, what do you mean by evolution? As we stated during the first presentation, it's important to define our terms. And there are at least 6 different definitions for evolution depending on who you ask. Sometimes it's a few more or less, so that just muddies it up even more. It's a very important question to ask. What do you mean by evolution? While there are multiple definitions for evolution, we are going to concentrate on the 2 best known and most commonly used definitions, microevolution and macroevolution. When you ask, what do you mean by evolution, find out if the person is talking about microevolution, which is defined as observable, limited adaptations within a species and refers to the genetic variations within the species. Dog breeding is a very good example of microevolution. We see everything from wolfhounds to chihuahuas, but they all still belong to the canine species. Or is the person talking about macroevolution, which is defined as the belief that all life forms have descended from a common ancestor by natural processes without intelligent intervention? Darwin used a tree to illustrate this theory, with the simpler life forms at the base of the tree branching out into the more complex life forms toward the top. Clearly, there is a big difference between microevolution and macroevolution, so it's important to make the distinction, to define our terms. If someone asks, do you believe in evolution? Ask them what they mean by evolution. If they're talking about microevolution, changes within the type, as in dog breeding, then yes, there's good evidence to support that. If they mean macroevolution, changes across the type from one species into another species, well, then no, there's no evidence to support that. In fact, we'll see in a few moments that there is actually ample evidence against that. So if someone asks you, do you believe in evolution? What are you going to ask them? Exactly. What do you mean by evolution? Good job, guys. All right. All too often, people don't make the distinction. They want to point to the evidence for microevolution and say that the same evidence supports macroevolution, which it doesn't. To prove that point, we'll begin by examining the 2 central arguments for macroevolution. The first argument is micro to macro. This argument says that small adaptations lead to new life forms, that given enough time, microevolution gives way to macroevolution. All right, then, let's start with what we know about microevolution and go back to the example of dog breeding. Over centuries of dog breeding, the dogs only get so big, so small, so hairy, so whatever. Breeders meet with genetic limits, so no matter what variations they may come up with, they still come up with dogs. Evolutionists will tell us that over the centuries of dog breeding, that in spite of those centuries, there still hasn't been enough time for necessary for microevolution to lead to macroevolution. So in order to incorporate more time, experiments have been conducted on fruit flies. Because of their short lifespan, scientists can perform genetic manipulations on thousands of generations of fruit flies. And at the end of the day, they still have what? What do you think? Yeah, fruit flies. Now, some of them are mutant fruit flies with, wings growing out of their heads, but they don't even get a horse fly, let alone a horse. There you go. That's a good one, Kevin. Thanks. If all the cumulative intelligence, experience, and manipulations of scientists and dog breeders can't break the genetic limits designed within each species, how can non-intelligence exceed them? I don't know about you guys, but I don't have enough faith to believe that that could happen by random chance. In November of 2004, National Geographic's cover story asked the thought-provoking question, was Darwin wrong? What do you suppose their conclusion was? How did they answer? They said, no, Darwin wasn't wrong, he was right. And what do you suppose their best, strongest piece of evidence was? A picture of this guy. They gave an example of microevolution to say it proved macroevolution. Shame, Nat Geo. All right, so when somebody asks if you believe in evolution, what do you need to ask them? Yeah, you guys are going to go away with this one tonight. All right. Next, we're going to look at homology. Homology is the concept that similarities in structure and DNA are evidences of a common ancestor. In 1991, Philip Johnson authored the book Darwin on Trial about the creation versus evolution debate. Johnson favored the position of creation by intelligent design. Having read Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker, which favored the evolution position, Johnson wrote Dawkins a letter and asked him to summarize the best piece of evidence he had to support evolution. This was Dawkins' response. The reason we know for certain we are all related, including bacteria, is the universality of the genetic code and other biochemical fundamentals. The genetic code he is referring to is coding information in DNA that can be found in all living organisms, including humans. So we definitely need to address the fact that this similarity exists between all living creatures. So what about DNA similarity? By a show of hands, how many of you have heard something like this? Humans and apes share 96% of their DNA. Anybody hear that? Yeah. Now, so that's one of the leading arguments for homology, but how good of an argument is it? It's a misleading comparison. The similarity is in the 2% of the genome that codes for proteins, not in the 98% that does not. A genome is the complete set of genetic material in an organism. So what they're really telling us is that there is a 96% similarity in only 2% of the genetic material. Not so similar after all. Additionally, the 98%, the non-coding region, is not useless junk as Darwinists have predicted. We're discovering it has function. Scientists within the intelligent design movement are at the forefront of these discoveries. Evolutionists thought the non-coding region was junk left over because we evolved from lower life forms. It wasn't worth investigation. And what if we consider that DNA similarity could be the evidence of a common designer rather than a common ancestor? Structures with similar functions often have similar blueprints. Perhaps all living things were designed with DNA in order to create a food chain. It's a perfectly logical explanation for the similarity in the genetic code. So why won't Richard Dawkins even consider a common designer instead of a common ancestor? Because a designer denotes an intelligent source. Let's take another look at Dawkins' quote from his letter to Johnson. The reason we know for certain we are all related, including bacteria, is the universality of the genetic code and other biochemical fundamentals. This is naturalistic philosophy disguised as science. How does he know for certain if he's not willing to consider or even investigate a viable alternative explanation? He has a philosophical bias against the evidence. Now that's a pretty harsh accusation to level against a scientist. How can I be so sure? Richard Dawkins tells us himself. In his letter to Johnson, he goes on to say, my philosophical commitment to materialism and reductionism is true, but I would prefer to characterize it as philosophical commitment to real explanation, as opposed to complete lack of explanation, which is what you espouse. In spite of the fact that in all our prior experience, messages and information only come from minds, an intelligent source, Dawkins is calling evidence of intelligent design a complete lack of explanation because he has ruled it out in advance. By his own admission, he is guilty of ruling out intelligence beforehand, begging the question, assuming what it is he's trying to prove. While it's true that all living things possess a genetic code, Darwinists must explain the vast dissimilarity between living things. The bee, the octopus, the Venus flytrap, mildew, the peacock, the porcupine, the human. Using DNA and homology as arguments for macroevolution results in circular reasoning. Let us show you what we mean. We know evolution is true because of DNA and homology. They show us that we all have a common ancestor. Well, why not a common designer? Because evolution is true. How do we know evolution is true? Because of DNA and homology. Round and round we go. That's circular reasoning. There's no genuine conclusion. Obviously, evolution is a huge subject, and we can barely scratch the surface in the time we have. However, we would be negligent if we didn't mention the topics of natural selection and the fossil record. Natural selection refers to the fact that traits that assist in the survival of a species tend to be dominant within the species. These traits are generally related to the environment and explain why we don't see chihuahuas in Alaska or huskies in Mexico. Natural selection is a key component of the microevolutionary process. Quite possibly you've heard about Darwin's finches. Darwin observed microevolutionary changes in the finches on the Galapagos Islands, which helped him to develop his theory of natural selection. He then used those observations as an argument for macroevolution. What he observed was a change in the depth of the finches' beaks based on weather patterns. The beak depth was greater in a dry year when it was more difficult to extract seeds and bugs from the ground, and lesser in a wet year when it was easier to get seeds and bugs. The data shows a trait that assists in the finch's survival changing in relationship to the finch's environment. The change is cyclical. Natural selection provides absolutely no evidence whatsoever for macroevolution. There is no directional change. Just like the examples of dog breeders who start and end with dogs and scientists who start and end with fruit flies, Darwin started and ended with finches. Natural selection can help to explain the survival of a species, but not the arrival of a species. Where did the finches come from to begin with? Proponents of Darwinian evolution would have us to believe that these cute little guys used to be dinosaurs. They claim that not all dinosaurs met with extinction, that some of them evolved by random chance from one species into another species, by growing feathers instead of scales and developing the intricate systems necessary for flight. I'm not making this up. Okay, so that sounds crazy, but what about the fossil record? Doesn't that prove macroevolution is true? The evolutionary theory relies heavily on data from the fossil record. We've all seen the illustrations in the textbooks, but remember that the fossil record itself doesn't say anything. Nobody ever found a fossil with a tag on it giving its origin information or the reason for its demise. Fossils are data, and all data needs to be interpreted. Science doesn't say anything, scientists do. Brilliant people within the scientific community interpret the data represented by the fossil record very differently. Dr. Jason Lyle of the Institute for Creation Research does numerous presentations you can find on YouTube in which he presents overwhelming evidence to support his belief that the fossil record is actually an embarrassment to Darwinian evolution. Dr. Stephen Meyer upset proponents of Darwinian evolution so badly with his book, Darwin's Doubt, that the Royal Society, the world's oldest independent scientific academy, held numerous meetings in the UK in 2016 to reconfigure the theory. Meetings that resulted in much division within the academy, but no significant changes to the theory. This is Stephen Jay Gould. He was one of the most influential evolutionary biologists of the 20th century. His prolific essays tell us that the fossil record does not support Darwinian evolution, which depends on gradualism. Gradualism is the idea that the species we see in the world today, including humans, derive from less complex species quite gradually, with small changes occurring over vast periods of time. It's part of the micro to macro argument that we looked at for macroevolution, which says that small adaptations eventually lead to new life forms, that given enough time, microevolution will eventually give way to macroevolution. But the fossil record does not support this view. Professor Gould tells us the history of most fossil species includes two features particularly inconsistent with gradualism. One is stasis. Most species exhibit no directional change during their tenure on Earth. They appear in the fossil record looking much the same as when they disappear. Morphological change is usually limited and directionless. And two, sudden appearance. In any local area, a species does not arise gradually by the steady transformation of its ancestors. It appears all at once and fully formed. For a more visual support of these claims, we're going to watch a short clip from the film Darwin's Doubt. The film is based on the book of the same name by Stephen Meyer that I mentioned earlier.
The basic body plan of the arthropod phylum has a segmented torso, jointed legs, and an exoskeleton, all of which arose suddenly at the beginning of the Cambrian explosion. And today we still see the continuity of this original plan, this foundational idea, in over 1 million species of animals.
This top-down pattern has nothing but limitations of Darwin's theory.
Darwin's theory is a bit of a tree of life. So we have one organism diverging into many other organisms, and big differences occur at the top. What we really see is from here up. This does not exist in the fossil record. If I were using a botanical illustration, it would be a lawn with separate blades of grass sprouting independently of each other. And this would be the phylum. Now within each phylum, there is subsequent diversification. But even there, I don't see the branches connecting that would make them a tree of life.
Darwin was caught in the grip of a deep dilemma. The fossil record showed him one thing, his theory told him something else. He comes to an impasse at this point. He says, if this pattern holds, it is a genuine argument against mankind. And I think 150 years later, he's added a great deal more detail to the picture, but I think the basic problem is still unsolved.
All right, did you guys catch the quote by Dawkins at the end? Without gradualness, we're back to a miracle. Here's another quote from Professor Gould. The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. There are a significant number of biologists who would interpret the same data and conclude that there are actually no transitional fossil forms, that all fossils represent fully formed species. For the sake of our presentation, we'll adopt Professor Gould's position that although rare, some transitional fossil forms do exist in the fossil record. Why are they so rare? If we all evolved from a common ancestor, they should be abundant. One reason they're so rare is something called irreducible complexity. Now that sounds like something super complicated, but it's not. Irreducible complexity just means that all the parts of a system have to be present in order for the system to function. In fact, I'm going to show you guys an irreducibly complex system right now, and it's something you're going to all recognize. It's a simple mousetrap. So we have 5 parts here. We have the platform. Oh, this is a new one, so we have that all typed. Okay, so we have the platform. This is the hammer, and it's controlled by the spring. We've got the hold down bar and the catch. Now, if any of those pieces are missing or substandard, this won't perform. But with all those simple 5 pieces in place, we can catch mice. So that in itself is an irreducibly complex system. We now know that biological systems are also irreducibly complex. Darwin himself conceded, and I quote, "If it cannot be demonstrated that any complex organism exists which could not possibly have been formed, by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. The field of microbiology, which admittedly did not exist in Darwin's day, has shown us that almost all biological systems are irreducibly complex. The systems that allow a bird to fly, a fish to breathe, and even a human eyeball are all irreducibly complex. From the microscopic flagellum that propels E. coli bacteria to the human circulatory system, biological systems are irreducibly complex and would not survive the numerous successive slight modifications necessary for gradualism, for one species to eventually turn into another species, no matter how much time is allotted. And that's just one reason why we don't see transitional forms in the fossil record. There's many others, but we just don't have time to cover them all. Instead, we're going to leave the topic of the fossil record and evolution with this quote from the issue of National Geographic that I referred to earlier. I can hardly believe they put this in print. Wait till you see it. Illuminating but spotty, the fossil record is like a film of evolution from which 999 of every 1,000 frames have been lost on the cutting room floor. Are you kidding me? What is their definition of spotty? What if you saw a movie that had lost 999 of every 1,000 frames on the cutting room floor? Would you understand anything about the characters or the plot? No. But what would the fossil record look like if intelligent design is true? Exactly like it does. All major body types appearing at once, no fossils of transitionary life forms. So not only is there evidence, no evidence for the gradualness necessary for macroevolution to be true, there's abundant evidence against it. I know that was a lot of information, but our summary hits just a few easy to remember but very important highlights. First, microevolution, which results in variations within the species, is something we know to be true. There's abundant observable evidence to support it. Second, macroevolution, resulting in changes from one species into another species, is not true. There's no evidence to support that it is. However, there is abundant evidence to support that it is not. Finally, even if macroevolution was true, it wouldn't mean God doesn't exist. We still need an explanation for the origin of life and the universe. The scientific evidence we've looked at is barely the smallest tip of a very large iceberg of evidence pointing to the fallacies of the macroevolutionary theory and the strong case for intelligent design. Our Bible verse for this lesson is from Psalm 139, verses 13 and 14, and supports the intelligent design explanation for the origin of human life. For you formed my inward parts. You wove me together in my mother's womb. I will give thanks to you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. According to this verse of Scripture and many, many others, it is God who is responsible for the creation of each human being. We are not the results of blind evolutionary process. All right, we need to move on to our third great argument for a theistic God, the argument for morality. Our first two arguments were scientific in nature. They can be discovered by looking out through a telescope or into a microscope, but the moral argument is philosophical in nature. That brings us right into lesson 6, the moral law. Make sure you're on page 10 of your curriculum. Take a second to look that over. As you'll soon realize, or maybe you already do, the moral law is something we've all known from our earliest youth. The moral law says that if there is even one thing truly objectively wrong, like killing 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, there has to be a God. Why? Because if there is no God, no standard for morality beyond humanity, then everything just becomes a matter of opinion. But we all know intuitively that there are things objectively right and objectively wrong, so there must be an objective standard. The image you're about to see is what the Allied forces saw when they liberated the Buchenwald concentration camp in what was left of Nazi Germany in the year 1945. We see this and we're horrified. We know this is wrong, but Hitler didn't think it was. And if there is no God, this is just a matter of Hitler's opinion versus ours. Is this just a matter of opinion? Of course not. How do we justify that we are right about this being wrong? Here you see the moral giant, Mother Teresa, and the moral midget, Hitler. How do we discover and therefore justify who's right and who's wrong? Here's an illustration that will help us with that question. How do we discover which is the better map of Scotland, map A or map B? What do we need to see to make that discovery? That's right, a map of the real unchanging Scotland. Now, if Scotland doesn't exist, if there is no Scotland, then the better map is just a matter of opinion. You like the letter A, then that's the map for you. You like the color blue, then B's your map. But Scotland does exist, and now that we have an objective reference, we can see that while it's not perfect, map A is a much better representation of the real unchanging Scotland. We can apply the same principle here to discover who's right and who's wrong. Mother Teresa can't be the standard. Hitler can't be the standard. The standard has to be beyond them both. God's unchanging moral nature is the standard of measurement. We use that standard to determine that Mother Teresa lives up to the standard better than does Hitler. Without the standard, it's just a matter of personal opinion. Now, people express their inherent knowledge of God's moral standards better in their reactions than in their actions. For example, someone who thinks it's okay to steal something is not going to think it's okay if you steal from him. If someone tries to tell you there is no real objective standard for right and wrong, just kick them in the shin and steal their smartphone. They'll change their mind real quick. Frank Turek was presenting this material once at Michigan State, and during the Q&A, a guy who was an atheist was challenging Frank's position that objective morality necessitates the existence of God. So Frank asked him, "Where do you think morality comes from?" And the guy replied, "It's whatever the majority decides." Frank then asked, "So if you had been in Nazi Germany when the majority decided it was moral to kill 6 million Jews, would you have agreed?" The guy paused, and he blushed, and then he said yes. And his buddy behind him yelled, "No," because he knew that was wrong. Well, the first guy knew it was wrong too, but he had to say yes to be consistent with his atheist viewpoint. And therein lies the problem with the atheist viewpoint as it relates to morality. Who gets to decide? Who gets to say what is moral and what isn't? If there is no objective standard beyond humanity that we can all look to, then someone within humanity decides. Should it be the majority? Why not the minority? What about just one really smart guy? Whose subjective opinion reigns, and why should anybody's subjective opinion reign? Atheists will frequently default to human flourishing as a response to the question and say that whatever promotes human flourishing is what is right for everybody. But what if the human flourishing of one group of people necessitates the genocide of another group of people? What then? Without an objective standard, it's all relative, just a matter of opinion. If there is no God, without that objective standard, then the Nazis were not wrong. Love is no better than rape. There are no human rights. Religious crusades are not wrong. And boy, we Christians hear a lot about that one, don't we? Tolerance is no better than intolerance. And if there is no God, we can't even complain about the problem of evil. What? Why not? C.S. Lewis himself of explanation in this quote. As an atheist, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? In other words, the shadows prove the sunshine. You can have sunshine with no shadows, but the shadows can't exist without the sunshine. Evil is like rust on a car. If you take away the rust, you still have a car. But if you take away the car, you have nothing. Rust can't exist on its own. Evil can't either. Evil is not a thing in itself. Evil is the absence of good. And evil doesn't disprove God. It might prove there's a devil, but it doesn't disprove God. Why? There would be no such thing as evil without a standard of good. And there's no such thing as a standard of good without God. We need to communicate a critical point to you at this juncture. We are not saying that atheists can't be moral. Indeed, they can. We are not saying atheists don't know morality. They do. What we are saying is that atheists can morality. Knowing what's right does not explain why the standard of rightness exists. You can know what's in a book and deny there is an author, but there would be no book to know unless there was an author. Atheists can know what's right and deny God, but there would be no right without God. Atheists steal objective morality from God in order to argue against him. Atheist Christopher Hitchens wrote this book, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. What does he mean by poison? Basically, he's saying religion is evil. But how can there be evil unless there's a measure of good? And how can there be a measure of good unless there's an unchanging, objective moral standard? And what else could qualify as an unchanging, objective moral standard other than God himself? By the way, religion doesn't poison everything. Everything poisons religion. I poison religion. I can't live up to the perfect, unchanging moral standard that is the very nature of God. That's why I need a Savior. So now we've shown that evil is actually an argument for the existence of God. As we stated at the beginning of the lesson, if there is anything objectively wrong or evil, God must exist. There's no evil without good, no good without God. But we all know there's evil, and there is good. There is an unchanging, objective, perfectly moral standard, and everybody knows it. Here's our summary for the moral argument. Evil is an argument for the existence of God. Something can't be truly evil unless there is an objective standard of good with which to compare it. The only thing that qualifies as an objective moral standard is God. The Bible tells us, for when the Gentiles who do not have the law do instinctively the things of the law, these, not having the law, are a law to themselves, in that they show the work of the law written on their hearts, their conscience bearing witness, their thoughts alternately accusing or else defending them. This verse tells us that all people are aware of an objective moral law. People don't need the Bible to know basic right and wrong. We've now finished looking at 3 of the many great arguments for a theistic God. The cosmological argument regarding the beginning of the universe, the teleological argument which speaks of the design of both the universe and life, and the moral argument which speaks of the fact that a transcendent moral law exists. We can now safely say that the most reasonable inference based on the evidence is that a theistic God does indeed exist. From these 3 arguments, we know that God is timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. Why? Because the cosmological argument provides evidence that he created time, space, and matter, so he must transcend those things. The cosmological argument also tells us that God is extremely powerful. He created everything from nothing. Did you ever consider that whatever we build or create, we're always using pre-existing materials? Not God. He created the materials. From the teleological argument, we know that God is extremely intelligent. The intelligence we see in the design of biological systems far exceeds our understanding. The design argument also tells us that since biological systems and natural laws behave in a goal-directed fashion, that God sustains creation and has purpose. From the moral argument, we know that God is absolutely morally perfect and that he's personal. How do we know that God is personal from the moral argument? Because you don't have moral obligations only to things. You only have moral obligations to persons. You're not sinning against the law of gravity if you dunk a basketball. We know that God is personal from the first 2 arguments as well. Why? Because God didn't have to create. He chose to create. And he made design choices within creation. And what makes choices? Not what, who. Only persons make choices. So now these 3 arguments give us a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, extremely powerful, extremely intelligent, sustaining, purposeful, absolutely morally perfect and personal God. You know who that sounds like, right? This is the God of the Bible identified without reference to the Bible. Remember, the Bible verses that we use to support the lessons were not necessary to validate the lessons. So doesn't this tell us that Christianity is true? No. This is necessary for Christianity to be true, but it's not sufficient. We need more evidence. We haven't even talked about Jesus yet. We haven't gotten there. Here, however, is what we have proved. You'll remember that the last time we were here, we looked at the three major religious worldviews. If our evidence is good up to this point, and we believe it is, we have just made the case for theism. God made all. Since theism is true, what does that do to pantheism and atheism? They can't be true. That would violate the law of non-contradiction. Here are the known possibilities in a theistic universe: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The list of religions in the other column cannot be true. It's important to note here that we are not saying that everything taught by the religions in the column on the right is false. They have elements of truth. What we are saying is that when it comes to the existence and nature of God, the evidence supports theism, which means that the religions on the right appear to have that wrong. Here, so which is true? Which is it? Is it Judaism, is it Christianity, or is it Islam? We've already come to the conclusion that there's sufficient evidence for a theistic God, so which one of these theistic religions is true? What could God do to let us know which one is true? He could do something that only God could do, and that would be miracles. So now we're up to question number 3. Are miracles possible? Question number 3 regarding the possibility of miracles has only one lesson, lesson 7. We'll take just a moment to make sure everybody's on the right page, page 12, give you a chance to look that over. And the lesson is signs of God or gullibility. Think back to a time 500 years ago or more when there were no mass communication capabilities. If a king wanted to send a message to another king over a great distance, what would he do? He would use a courier to send the message, and on the message would be a seal. The seal on the message would authenticate that the message came from the first king. The seal would have to have 2 important qualities. It would have to be unique to the first king, and it would have to be difficult to forge. Miracles meet the seal criteria. They are both unique and difficult to forge. When God does miracles through people in the biblical accounts, that's what they are. They're a seal from God that says, this guy speaks for me. How do we know this? Consider Moses. God enables Moses to do miracles so that people realize Moses speaks for God. The purpose of miracles in the Bible is to confirm a prophet. The miracle confirms the message. The sign confirms the sermon. There's a common misconception in the Bible that miracles are taking place all the time, but that's not accurate. The miracles in the Bible that God does through people mostly occurred in 3 specific time frames: during the times of Moses, the days of the prophets Elijah and Elisha, and the times of Jesus and the apostles. Why? These are new prophets that need new confirmation. There's a new message that needs a new miracle, a new sermon that needs a new sign. Note that miracles are never done for entertainment purposes, and they are never done for the personal edification of the one doing the miracle. Paul did miracles, and yet he was unable to heal his own infirmity, his thorn in the flesh, whatever that may have been. Consider this. If miracles are not possible, then every person since the beginning of time that claims to have seen or experienced a miracle is wrong. Is that possible? Sure. Is it probable? I don't think so. Still, some people believe miracles are impossible. Chances are you personally know somebody who doesn't believe them. Noah's Ark. How can you believe that? It's outlandish. And resurrections. They're not buying it, especially since everyone they've ever known who has died is still dead. And Jonah? Is that a tale of a whale or a whale of a tale? These accounts are as hotly disputed as they are amazing. But what is the greatest miracle in the Bible? It's the very first verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We've examined very good evidence that this verse is true, that God created the universe out of nothing. And if this verse is true, then every other miracle in the Bible is at least believable. If God can create the universe, can he do anything logically possible inside the universe? Of course. Flooding the earth and preserving life on the ark was a piece of cake. If he could create men and fish, he could surely bring about the events that happened to one man and one fish as they're described in the book of Jonah. It's interesting to note that Jesus authenticated both of these miracles by comparing the events to aspects of his own life. In Matthew 24:37, Jesus said, "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man." And in Matthew 12:40, Jesus said, "For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." Jesus considered the accounts of Noah and Jonah to be historical, not hysterical. C.S. Lewis offers marvelous insight, as he so often did. But if we admit God, must we admit miracles? Indeed, you have no security against it. That is the bargain. 18th century philosopher who is one of the greatest skeptics of the Age of Enlightenment. He came up with a formal argument against miracles. So did David Hume prove miracles are not credible? Let's see. Natural law is by definition description of a regular occurrence. In other words, natural laws regularly do the same thing over and over, like gravity. A miracle is by definition a rare occurrence. Miracles have to be rare, or they lose their value in terms of getting us to believe the message is from God. If resurrections occurred regularly, we would have no reason to believe that the resurrection of Jesus from the dead was a genuine miracle of God. The evidence for the regular is always greater than that for the rare. A wise man always bases his belief on the greater evidence. Conclusion, therefore, a wise man should never believe in miracles. If premises 1 through 4 are true, then the conclusion logically follows and is also true. But they're not. One of these 4 premises is flawed. Which one is it? It's number 3. The correct answer to Hume's objection is that the evidence for regular events is not always greater than that for the rare. We can use examples from Hume's own worldview to prove that the 3rd premise from his argument against miracles is false. The Big Bang is not based on regular events. The origin of life on Earth does not occur regularly. Macroevolution cannot be repeated. The entire history of the Earth cannot be repeated. All of these events are rare, thereby proving evidence for the regular is not always greater. If Hume's argument was true, there would be no reason for him to believe in his own existence, since his birth was a rare occurrence, having happened only once. And notice that he's not talking about the possibility of miracles, he's only referring to the believability of miracles. It's a fallacious argument, and yet it's still being used by atheists in our universities today. That's why we need to be aware of it. Now, wait a minute. If we know Hume's argument is flawed, and it's obvious that it is, why is it still being taught? Philosophical bias. This is Richard Lewontin. He's an atheist, a Marxist, and has served as both a teacher and professor at Harvard. He said, "It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept the material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door." Why can't we allow a divine foot in the door? Because secular scientists want us to think that all truth comes only from science. And if God gets in, scientists will no longer be seen as the priests of the New Age, the only ones capable of dispensing truth to society. They won't get research grants, accolades from their intellectual colleagues at cocktail parties, or book deals. If God gets in, they might have to submit to a higher authority, bow to a creator, and many people don't want to do that. This may not apply to all atheists, but it's a known motivation for many. Thomas Nagel, an atheist professor at NYU, admitted, "I have a cosmic authority problem." When atheist Christopher Hitchens debated Frank Turek, he shook his fist in the air and proclaimed, "I will not submit to this divine tyranny." Well, who is the divine tyrant? It's God. They don't want God to exist. The elephant in the room is morality. People don't want God to exist because they want to do their own thing. They want to do whatever they want to do. Author Ron Carlson lectured at universities on the problems with Darwinism. He went to lunch with the biology professor after one of his lectures, and he asked the professor what he thought about the lecture. He agreed with Ron that the Darwinian theory of evolution has some serious problems, but he said he would continue to teach it anyway. Ron asked him why he would do that, and the professor told him because Darwinism was morally comfortable. He admitted that as long as we're all descended from green algae, I can continue to sleep with whomever I want. Think about that. The biology professor's reason for continuing to teach evolution, in spite of the evidence against it, was because he found it morally comfortable. And you thought science was objective. It's not. It's only as objective as a scientist, because science doesn't say anything. Scientists do. You have to remember that. We saw this quote from Pascal in our last session, but it bears repeating. People almost invariably arrive at their beliefs not on the basis of proof, but on the basis of what they find attractive. Whether or not you find the idea of miracles to be attractive, Hume's objections to miracles don't work, and Lewontin's objections to miracles are nothing more than philosophical bias, by his own admission. We have examined very good evidence that shows a theistic God created the entire universe out of nothing, and if that's not a miracle, we don't know what is. Just the fact that the universe exists is proof that, yes, miracles are possible. To summarize, creating the entire universe out of nothing is the greatest miracle in the Bible. As we pointed out in this lesson, we have already examined good empirical scientific evidence to support this conclusion. Since God created the universe, he can do anything logically possible within the universe. We'll take this opportunity to correct another common misconception. There are some things God cannot do. He cannot do anything logically impossible. Therefore, he can't create a married bachelor. He can't create a one-ended stick or a rock so big he can't lift it. Those are logical impossibilities. However, the miracles we read about in the Bible are logical and therefore possible. Finally, philosophically ruling out miracles in advance is not good philosophy. Why would a philosopher, scientist, or anyone rule out any possible conclusion in advance? In a genuine search for the truth, a person should be dedicated to examining the evidence and following the truth, wherever it may lead them. And if a person is not on a genuine search for the truth, why search at all? Our scripture reading is from Hebrews chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. How will we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? After it was at the first spoken through the Lord, it was confirmed to us by those who heard, God also testifying with them, both by signs and wonders, and by various miracles, and by gifts of the Holy Spirit according to his own will. The writer of Hebrews is confirming that God used miracles to give credibility to the gospel message and the messengers. He claims that the evidence of miracles used was so great, it prompted him to ask, how will we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? How indeed? The question merits our serious consideration. All right, this means that the answers to our first three questions are all yes. Absolute truth does exist. A theistic God does exist. And yes, miracles are possible. That brings us to our fourth and final question. Is the New Testament true? In order to determine if the New Testament is reliable, we have to answer two questions. One, do we have an accurate copy of the New Testament documents? If we don't, we have no way of knowing if the New Testament is reliable. And two, do the original New Testament documents tell the truth? It doesn't matter if we have accurate copies if the original documents don't tell the truth. We'll close out this session by looking at the first of the two questions. Do we have an accurate copy of the original New Testament documents? The question gives us for lesson number 8. Do we have an accurate copy? Make sure you're on page 14 for this lesson. Look it over and we'll continue. We won't spend a lot of time on this because it is actually a very settled question in scholarship among Christians and atheists alike. Because we have so many early manuscripts. 48,000 New Testament verses are in manuscripts earlier than 225. We have so many manuscripts stack over a mile, the total Greek manuscripts stack over a mile high compared to only 4 feet for classical Greek authors outside of the Bible. Bruce Metzger was one of the most renowned New Testament scholars of our time. Lee Strobel interviewed Bruce Metzger while writing inextricable documents. Over 36,000 quotations from the early church fathers can be found in documents other than the Bible. Over half the New Testament can be reconstructed from these documents, and all of these early, many, and corroborated manuscripts were copied with a 99.5% accuracy rating. That's outstanding. 80% of the variants are spelling variations and don't affect the meaning of the text. Examples would be variations like Christ Jesus instead of Jesus Christ, or the spelling of Peter, who is also called Simon Peter, as Cephas. None of the variants affect any significant Christian doctrine. Now let's take a look at how the New Testament documents compare to other ancient writings. There are no original manuscripts for any of these classical Greek or Roman authors. This chart shows us the number of copies that support each work, as well as the number of years from the dating of the originals to the earliest copy. The New Testament documents enjoy an extensive number of 2,200 as the second best offering. Now look at the time gap in years. Only 25 years from the timing of the earliest New Testament documents until the first copies versus 500 years for Homer, or as many as 1,400 for Demosthenes. And yet the scholars who are involved in the field of study known as textual criticism have no doubt that the documents we now possess by these Greek and Roman authors are accurate copies of the originals. The very same scholars, many of whom are not Christians, also have no doubt that the New Testament documents we now possess are accurate copies of the originals. So how do we know what the originals said if we don't have the original manuscripts? Textual critics compile, compare, and reconstruct to arrive at their conclusions regarding what an original manuscript must have said. Here's a real simplified example of how that works. We'll compile and compare these 4 manuscript copies, and as you can see, each one is just a little bit different. Now, if this is what we have to work with, can we accurately reconstruct? Do we know what the original said? Of course we do. God is just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. But here's the catch. The New Testament documents have far fewer variations than even this example does. But wouldn't it be better if we just had the originals? Consider this. If we had the originals, wars would be fought to possess them, people would worship them as holy, they would wreak havoc. Besides, if the original documents had been in possession of just one person at any time, they could have been changed. If there's multiple copies, especially early on, nobody can change the content. Ironically, by not preserving the original documents, God preserved the original content. If you had a copy and you had a copy and you had a copy and you had a copy, and then he changed his copy, we would all. Besides, how can anyone know a text had been changed unless they knew what the original said? Sir Frederick Kenyon, former director of the British Museum, says on page 23 of his book, Our Bible and the Ancient Manuscripts, it cannot be too strongly asserted that in substance of text, the Bible is certain, especially is the case with the New Testament. So here's a summary of the reasons we can safely conclude that we do in fact have an accurate copy of the original New Testament documents. With the Greek New Testament copies at about 5,700, we can reconstruct the texts with great accuracy. Over 36,000 quotations of the scriptures from the early church fathers assist with the reconstruction. Variations are primarily spelling and word order differences. They do not affect a single doctrine. Atheists and skeptical scholars agree. We have an accurate copy of the New Testament documents. Paul spoke these words while on trial before King Agrippa. For the king knows about these matters, and I speak to him also with confidence, since I am persuaded that none of these things escape his notice, for this has not been done in a corner. Paul is confirming the accuracy of his claims regarding Jesus by appealing to the king's own knowledge about local, recent events that were later recorded in the pages of New Testament scripture. Obviously, Paul could not have made that appeal if he weren't speaking the truth. Similarly, we appeal to known facts in order to conclude that we have an accurate copy of the original New Testament. All right, let's recap. Does truth exist? Yes. Does God exist? Yes. Are miracles possible? Yes. Is the New Testament true? Well, that remains to be seen. But we do know we have accurate copies of the New Testament documents. So next time we'll close out our series by examining evidence that will tell us if those documents tell the truth. We'll look at what books are in the Bible and talk about, so what if it is true? What then?